Hello and welcome back, and that's right, we've asked Ed of SpaceInvaderOne back onto the channel. We're going to continue talking about Turnkey, NAS and UnRAID, and in today's video is going to be slightly less combative than the last one. Today we're going to talk about the NAS to UnRAID tipping point. I think it would be fair to say that a number of you that followed this channel at the beginning, or people that have been following Ed on his channel for a while, you may not have arrived at UnRAID at the first thing you used. UnRAID might have been a gradual graduation of something you had before. You might have gone Turnkey, maybe some Billy Basic WD MyCloud. Maybe you had something a bit more advanced. And then eventually you went, do you know what? This UnRAID thing sounds cool. I'm going to give that a punt. And today what we want to talk about is the tipping point. The point when a Turnkey NAS owner moves to UnRAID. We're going to try and identify each of the hot points which makes the user jump, because maybe this is the video that's going to make you make that switch, and you've been on the the edge for a while when you've been thinking about it, and maybe this video will help you. But before we go any further, you may have watched the other video, but maybe you haven't. Ed, introduce yourself.
Hi, my name's Ed, and I run a YouTube channel called SpaceInvaderOne, which mainly makes tutorials all about UnRAID. So if you want to learn about setting things up on UnRAID, then check my channel out. I'm also the host of the Uncast show, which is UnRAID's official podcast. I'm a general nerd and tinkerer, and that's me.
I mean, your UnRAID journey, if I remember from our previous video, you didn't start with UnRAID.
No, I didn't. I actually, yes, I didn't mention it again because in the last podcast I said about that. I started with a Buffalo Link station with 4 drives. Had the great idea that I would buy the cheapest one and swap out the hard drives, sell them on eBay before buying new hard drives, to only find that the operating system was stored on the hard drives and my NAS was broken.
You were
Managed
livid.
to fix it. And then the tipping point for me to kind of move to something else was when that link station became full, and I just had to, I had to put the data somewhere, and so it meant kind of buying at least the amount of storage that was in the link station plus the extra I wanted. So that was when I questioned, is this really very smart using, just off-the-shelf products like this for my needs?
And again, I think that is a story that we hear a lot, not just with UnRAID as well, when a lot of people move from Turnkey NAS and the ease and simplicity of Synology, QNAP, etc. And when they get a few little bits of knowledge under their belt, a lot of people do realise that the open source alternatives out there, for those that don't mind getting a bit of thermal paste under the fingertips and the odd screwdriver, UnRAID, TrueNAS, all of the kind of open source or semi-open source stuff out there, or freemium, they do have a huge amount of appeal, and today hopefully we're going to isolate some of those. So it comes down to 5 factors for me that we're going to be touching in today's video. The first one is, of course, price, then skill, then scale, and then efficiency, and then finally freedom. Because all of these, for me, for a different kind of user, are the reasons that someone moves away from Turnkey NAS and onto UnRAID. Maybe one day we'll make a video that's the reverse of this, for people that go from UnRAID to Turnkey NAS. If that does happen, it will be on the Space Invader channel, and I'm fairly certain it won't go well because there's fewer points in the other direction. I hate to say it, but it's true. But straight away, price. What is the tipping point for people that buy Turnkey NAS when it comes to the price? Well, for me, in all the time that I've been looking at Turnkey NAS solutions, normally it's around about the 500 nicker to maybe $1,000 at the top end. When users start to spend more than that amount of money, if they know that they're not getting a service level integration, or it's for a business purpose where they haven't got time to mess around with it, once a user gets between that 500 and $1,000 mark, that's when you start to see the DIYers. That's where you see the build it yourself or repurposing old technology, because a lot of the time when Turnkey NASs exceed that number, you're paying for the software that they may not use or they're not aware of how to use. So for you personally, Ed, what do you think when it comes to money? What are we talking about for UnRAID in terms of cost?
You can build some very, very cheap UnRAID servers. You could build a fairly kind of decently performing server, not including the hard drives, if you wanted to go super cheap, for maybe £250. I can share a parts list with you, Robbie, if you want to have a look at.
While you get that ready on the screen share, I'll say right now, in NAS terms, if you're going to spend about 250 nicker, In Turnkey NAS, you would be getting something in the region of an ARM-based processor, maybe 1 gig of memory, 1 gigabit Ethernet, and you'll either get 2 or 4 bays, but the 4 bay will be even more limited. So again, for that sort of money, around 250, you're looking at a fairly low-end Turnkey NAS. Do you need to give you permission there, or have you got permission to share screen?
I think I've got permission here.
Lovely stuff. We're not going to cut this out. We're going to leave it all in.
Right, so hopefully you can see my screen here.
Yeah.
So I've added some parts into an Amazon basket here. It's coming to £255. Starting with a USB flash drive, because UnRAID boots off a flash drive into RAM. I chose the cheapest case I can find. Obviously, you can choose whatever case you would want, but I wanted to make this build really, really cheap. We've got 16 gigs of RAM here. A fairly kind of decent amount. I would imagine most Turnkey NASs at £250, you probably get maybe the maximum, I would say, of 4 gigs of RAM. The motherboard here, a Ryzen motherboard. I thought I'd make this a Ryzen build. This has 4 SATA ports, so we can have four hard drives. And for the processor, a Ryzen 3 1400 desktop PC, 4 cores and 8 threads, and an EVGA 600 watt power supply. Now, this CPU gets a fairly good pass mark score. If we have a look at the pass mark for this CPU, we get a pass mark of 11,000. Now, I think Robbie was mentioning on the last pass mark. Let's try and speak properly.
The last
Robbie
podcast,
was mentioning on the last podcast, not pass mark. He was mentioning on that I think there's some fairly new NASs that are coming out which have the Celeron J4125.
I think new would be pushing it. Some of the new Synology NASs with their 2019 Gen CPU, the J4125, yeah.
So I want to show you guys the pass mark of the J4125 CPU that you might buy in a Turnkey NAS for more expensive than what we put this together for. Well, the pass mark of that is 2,978. So compare that against the Ryzen at 11,000. And also the Ryzen is probably going to be more power efficient as well, because it's using a lower, nanometer manufacturing process. So probably the CPU would be more energy efficient.
Literally the only counterpoint I've got at the moment,
even though we see the TDP here as being 10 watts and the 65 watts here, I just want to make a kind of point that I think a lot of people kind of think is the TDP, that 65 watts, isn't how much power the CPU uses. That is how much heat it has to get rid of when it's working at its maximum rate. So yes, that can kind of equate to how much power the CPU can draw. But when it's not doing very much, it's probably going to idle at just maybe kind of 5 or 10 watts. But then you've got the scope to be able to, if it ramp, if you're going to be using all of the CPU, it can go up to this. So even though the CPU may not on paper seem as efficient, in real life, it will tend to be. In my server I'm running now, I have a 16-core CPU, 70 terabytes in one array, and probably another 40 in another, a bunch of NVMEs and a graphics card, and idle my server sits at 86 watts.
It's the same counter argument people use for PSUs. I was going to highlight, like, you can get a 500 watt or 1000 watt PSU. That just because it can reach those dizzying heights doesn't mean it's always going to. It's more of a delivery and draw equation. Like, genuinely, if this was our versus video, the only counter argument I could possibly make is you didn't include the SATA cables in your calculation. But knowing you, there was SATA cables with that motherboard included anyway. I think it's a good point with the power supplies, is because a lot of people think, I don't want to buy a 1,000 watt power supply because that will use so much energy, but it will probably use less energy than if you had a lower wattage lower wattage power supply. Because on the higher wattage power supplies, they will run cooler and quieter because the fan won't be spinning up all the time. But they won't use any more power from the wall. They'll just deliver what's needed. But I think ultimately, when it comes down to costs, right now it's inarguable that the tipping point. Again, I was going for 500 to $1,000, but by the looks of things, at least as far as hardware is concerned, that is incredibly competitive pricing there in terms of hardware, and it kind of puts a spotlight there on the cost of NAS software.
So what I wanted to kind of like say, with that is we can minus off the cost of the case of being, say, £30, and say you wanted a bigger case because you think in the future you might want to expand. So if I show you some other cases here, this is a nice little case, and I'll show you a motherboard for this case. It's a 4-bay case at £119, including VAT, 142. But what I would say you could do is, if you wanted something with more potential storage in the future, you can go to a case something like this here, which has 8 hot swappable 3.5-inch bays, and all of that hardware that I mentioned in the Amazon basket will fit inside this 4U rack mount case. You want to go more drives again, you could use something like this that has 16 hot swappable bays.
Still not spent 500 quid yet. We've still not spent 500 quid yet.
So we've got 16 hot swappable bays with like a backplane in there. We can fit any hardware we want in there, and with that, including the price of the other one, we've got the price of an average maybe 4-bay NAS. But this here, will take up 4 bays. But then we've got another 12 we can expand into as we go forward. So it's always worth kind of thinking about the future and expandability. So I think if you're going to spend £500 on a turnkey NAS, think about what you could build for yourself. You want to go 24 bays? Well, £300, you'll get a 24-bay 4U rack.
Again,
add that with the £200. How much was it? £255. Take off the price of the case at 30. That's £220 plus £361, including the VAT. Whatever that. Robbie's probably got better maths than me. I'm sure.
But I was going to say that's about the cost of a new Synology 4-bay with a dual-core embedded Ryzen. So that's not a full Ryzen either, and that doesn't even have 10G. It doesn't have all of those bells and whistles. But I'll be honest, I'm looking at those other tabs. Before we move on to our next section and you close the screen share, I'm going to go out on a limb and assume those are some second-hand eBay. So what are we talking about for second-hand
eBay?
So if we wanted to go second-hand eBay as a price, if we're looking for a tipping point away from turnkey and we're prepared to go second-hand, what are we talking?
Right, so second-hand, let's have a look here. Here we are. We've got this here, second hand. We've got an HP Gen 8 here. It looks like it's got 25 bays at the front, but this will be 2.5-inch drives. We can choose various kind of processors choices, here. Yeah. So let's kind of choose. You want some RAM? Well, here's 192 gigs of RAM.
All right, I'll get by. That'll run Candy Crush like you wouldn't believe.
And if we wanted 25 caddies, because obviously we're going to need some caddies, we're at £475 for 192 gig of RAM server. That'll be ECC RAM as well, because it's X Enterprise stuff. But the downside is it's going to use quite a lot of power.
Of course.
Going back to this motherboard here. Like I said, it only has. Can we bring that? It's only got 4 SATA ports, but you've got a PCIe slot here. And you can often find things like this on eBay, which is an HBA card. It has 2 cables that come off here. Each will take 4 drives each. So you can buy this. It's already been flashed. You can see here it says it's for FreeNAS, which is now TrueNAS nowadays, and UnRAID. So you would then plug that in, and you could plug that into one of these cases to link up. So even though that little motherboard with the 4 SATA ports has only got the 4 SATA ports, well, for an extra £40 buying that card, you can now have 12 drives and at least use 12 of those drives. You could upgrade the CPU if you want a faster Ryzen. You're not limited to just what you bought on day one. I'm going to show you something else as well, if I can find it. So we got this here. To be honest, I haven't done a lot of research because of how good a value this is, but I think it looks pretty decent to me. It's a bundle on Amazon where you've got the cooler, you've got the CPU, the motherboard, and the RAM. So we've got 16 gigs of RAM. We've got a Ryzen 3 3200G. Let's look at the pass mark for that.
We'll try and add these to our to the description below or for links, because I'll be straight with you, that one thing I find very curious. At that price point, that's insanity.
So pass mark, we've got 7,000, not quite as good as the
more than double the Intel though.
As the other Ryzen, but it's double the Intel. £170. I've got so many tabs, you have to scroll left and right.
Maybe you should get 16 gig of memory.
So, a good price, 16 gigs of RAM, everything kind of in here. So you don't really have to kind of put it together much. And you can pop that into this. So you've got, because this is a mini ITX board, pop it into this and you've got a nice, if you want something, for people who want something compact that sits in the corner, that's quiet, doesn't use much power. Well, for 300 odd pounds, you've got something quite nice.
It's phenomenal. And I mean, it just returns to the original point of when it comes to the tipping point between Turnkey and UnRAID. I think ultimately, although we will talk about the other 4 points now, when it comes to price, that's all. Price and cost and value for money are probably going to be one of the most consistent points. So that neatly brings us into another one of the reasons that people might, consider a tipping point to jump ship away from Turnkey NAS and move towards their own UnRAID server, and that is simple skill set. We joked around about this in a previous video, but of all of the non-turnkey inclusive hardware software solutions out there, UnRAID has a long-running reputation for being one of the most user-friendly, and one of its most user-friendly attributes is indeed the setup. And as much as I love NAS, and as much as I talk about how network-attached storage, turnkey, inclusive storage is really, really easy to set up, hold your hand all the time, there's lots of client apps, I think the skill set for UnRAID, particularly, I would say, if you buy a ready-made solution like some of the ones we just discussed, it's going to be, how difficult are we talking, Ed, of how easy is UnRAID to begin with?
I would say it's very easy to set up UnRAID. It needs a little bit more sort of skill than obviously just something off the shelf where you plug it in and turn the power button on. But if you've got any type of PC experience, if you can plug a flash drive in the side of your PC or your Mac, you can download the software from the website, and then that software will write the operating system to the USB key. You then plug that USB key into whatever hardware you've decided you want to have, make the motherboard boot up from that USB key, normally going into the BIOS with the F12 or delete key, choosing along the top of the menu, there'll be somewhere that says boot order, choosing that USB flash drive to be the first boot. And then it will boot off that, boot into the RAM. You'll be presented with the UnRAID GUI. You'll first be asked to set up a username and password, and then you'll be straight in and you'll be able to choose which disks you want to use in your UnRAID array or any other pools. So the hardest part really is going to be probably just choosing which disk to put where,
or which USB to buy.
So it's going to be pretty simple, and that's as much as you need to do. The beauty of UnRAID is it can be very simple, but for people who want to stretch their legs a bit more and kind of do something more complex, you can do both. So it is very, very easy to set up your storage just for a regular NAS. Choose your drives. It will do a parity sync, which basically, with the normal UnRAID array, which basically makes sure all of your data is protected. It syncs up the parity and calculates a parity. After that, you're ready to use it straight away. And however far you go is kind of up to you, really.
Again, that skill set thing, I've made videos already previously about how people can install UnRAID on an existing turnkey NAS solution, with the bulk of them allowing that. And I've emulated many times on the channel just how straightforward it is to install UnRAID on your existing NAS hardware that may well be outside of warranty. Indeed.
I would say, the there's some people out there who would never like to install Windows themselves. They want to buy a laptop from a big box store, come back, plug it in, and they don't even want to kind of like think, oh, I don't want to kind of like even type in my kind of username and password and stuff like that. For you people, a turnkey is going to be probably the best thing for people who really don't want to do anything at all. But for anyone who's kind of like installed Windows themselves on their own PC, they've reinstalled Windows, they've reinstalled them their operating system if they've got an Apple Mac. If you can do that, I guarantee you can install UnRAID. Don't be scared because it's like scary Linux word. It's super easy to use. It's all through a GUI. You know, you don't need to do any command line stuff. Everything can be point and click to set up. And then it's a very easy, intuitive UI after you've got it set up.
I would say right now that the people that are afraid to put in Windows that are watching this, they are also the same people that have got a Yahoo toolbar in their web browser. They're still running Norton, they're running Norton instead of AVG even. And frankly, they think WinRAR is a noise a dinosaur makes. But let's move on to the next tipping point, I think, for a lot of users, and that is, of course, the scale, the moving away from turnkey NAS solutions towards UnRAID. When it comes to the scalability of UnRAID, the tipping point for me, at least for existing NAS owners, is about the 8-bay mark. Unless you go into the rack mount sector where a business needs a more complete solution, they may not have a system admin, or they've got a system admin that is more preoccupied with, you know, why the people on floor 3 have knackered their PCs because they played Minesweeper till the end of the evening in 1998. When it comes to the scalability of NAS in desktop form, once you get to about 8 bays and you're already buying an 8 bay so you could scale up to it, or if you were going to fully populate that 8 bay, scalability is something you need to consider. And for those users that went to an 8 bay, I find more often than not that at that point is when they jump ship to UnRAID or other platforms such as TrueNAS due to their tremendous scalability. If you'd like to elaborate on that.
Yeah, so basically it's super easy to upscale your UnRAID servers, storage and hardware, to be honest. So, you know, if you like I said earlier, how I got into UnRAID in the first place is having a NAS that didn't have enough storage, and I was upset that I had to basically I had to put the data somewhere else before I could even have a chance to use those hard drives in the other NAS. So I had to buy, you know, quite a lot of hardware. But with UnRAID, you can just, you know, when you need to sort of scale up, buy a larger case. If you need a larger case, you can't fit the hard drives in, buy another hard drive, pop it into the server. And if you've got a server like, you know, what we were looking at earlier with the hotspot bays, you don't even have to take it apart. Just put it on the caddy, push it in, obviously with the server stopped, start it back up, and then you would just tell UnRAID, I want to use that disk in my array as well. And if that was a 10 terabyte drive, a 12 terabyte drive, a 20 terabyte drive, you've got that amount of space straight away, without having to kind of move your existing data anywhere else. It's there straight away.
It's that
the one caveat I would say with that is on the regular UnRAID array. If you've got ZFS arrays inside your UnRAID server, then you know, ZFS, you can't actually expand a ZFS array without adding what's called additional VDEVs to the pool, which have their own independent redundancy. Although for, I think, about a year now, it has been kind of mentioned that that ZFS is going to be able to have expandability in a Z pool.
They've tried, so maybe for a long
something
time.
That will come in the future.
They get closer and closer. It feels like one of those features. They may even have put it in some sort of beta form, but it's been such a long requested feature. But it's fundamentally changing the stripe values within ZFS there. But again, yes, scalability on UnRAID is completely. I mean, the fact that UnRAID's running on a USB that you can just pop in a new server, move your old drives over with more bays. But moving on to
you know, just with scalability, say, or you know, you just decide I want a new server. Take your hard drives out of your old one, buy some new hardware, steal some more hardware, borrow some more hardware, put those drives in, and put your USB flash drive in, and you'll be up and running probably within 20 minutes. You know, the hardware isn't kind of tied to UnRAID. It doesn't care. It will just see the serial numbers of the hard drives, and it will go, okay, there's disk 1, there's disk 2. Thank you very much. It doesn't care what it's running on. It doesn't care what CPU you've got. So you can scale up. You want a new CPU, put it in. That's fine. You want a new motherboard, you need some more RAM. You decide you want to kind of run more intensive things. You want to do VMs. That's fine. You don't have to get rid of all your data because you suddenly want to do VMs and your CPU wasn't good enough to do VMs. Maybe you buy a new CPU and a motherboard. You're up and running really quickly. You've scaled up and all your data's come across with you. All your Docker containers have come across with you. You're up and running.
I should add as well, just for my subscribers, Ed was not saying that you should steal hardware unless it's from bad people. Next up, we'll move on to what I think is one of the more divisive tipping points between NAS and UnRAID, because it's a little bit more nuanced and I don't think it's as black and white as most of the other points. And that comes down to efficiency, because NAS being, and I've mentioned this in our previous video about NAS being built around, in many ways, around the subject of efficiency. There is wiggle room, obviously, around the CPU choices, and we talked about market forces. But moving away from NAS towards UnRAID in terms of efficiency, now you touched on some of it earlier on there when you're looking at some of the hardware. We were talking about the difference between, total thermal numbers and PSU versus actual real utilization versus a maximum versus a typical scenario. But when it comes to NAS, I have found over time that until you get to the more aggressive hardware architecture of either rack mount, or when we see systems in NAS circles running, turnkey NAS circles running on, say, Intel Core processors, up until that point, most NAS systems are actually fantastically efficient in so many kind of small incremental ways, everything from the fans to the power consumption inside. A lot of the cooling systems are built around passive heat sinks, they'll end up being quieter as well. But I do find the tipping point for UnRAID, at least from what I've witnessed, and maybe you'll disagree, is around about the bigger, some of the entry into rack mount point, or it's when those more aggressive CPUs start featuring on turnkey NAS solutions. I mean, for you personally, when it comes to UnRAID and power efficiency, where do most users jump in? Is that at the rack mount level, or do people look at UnRAID much smaller servers in terms of power efficiency in UnRAID, or do they go, right, well, everything's cheaper, I'm going to go big? How do you find?
A lot of people, a lot of people I've noticed on in the UnRAID community, you get some people that want to build a very power efficient server. And I've heard of people running like an UnRAID server with kind of like an idle of kind of like 10 to 20 watts idle power. I think with turnkey, especially if they're using ARM processors, you're going to get better power efficiency with ARM CPUs than you will x86. But then I think power efficiency, once you kind of get starting to use kind of workloads that are going to need more powerful CPUs, the power efficiency equation doesn't really kind of come into it, because you can't have some workloads, run on just very weak CPUs. And so you're going to need, something a bit better. But it's really dependent on what you want to build yourself for how power efficient it's going to be. If you want something power efficient with UnRAID, then look for a power efficient CPU. Look for, if you're only interested in kind of storing data, you don't want to transcode 4K files to various different clients, like over the internet or in your house. You're not going to need a very powerful CPU. You're not going to need, an iGPU or separate GPU for transcoding and that kind of thing. So you can go with just a cheap, you can just go with a power efficient CPU and have an UnRAID array with no ZFS, no pulls. And then when you're reading just from one of those disks, all of the other disks will be spun down that are not in use. So you'll only get the power use of one drive being spun up. So if you had a 4-bay UnRAID server and you're only reading off, say, one of those disks, then you're only going to be powering one of those disks. If you've got a turnkey solution with 4 drives in there, when you're reading any data off there, all 4 drives will spin up. And I would say, what do you say, Robbie? A hard drive spun up, maybe use 5 watts, maybe?
Again, you're talking if full utilization along the rest of the line. I mean, one of the things I'd say, I mean, it kind of harks back to a tipping point within itself when we talk about ARM processors there. It does come down to, as you say, workloads and requirements. And if you use some of those more efficient hardware, you end up overtaxing those to do more, aggressive things. It's the argument that people use for integrated graphics on a processor versus a non-integrated graphics processor doing graphical processes, tools for the job. It's like the equivalent between playing Doom on your PlayStation or PC versus running it on a printer, a pregnancy test, or a smart fridge. Sure, it can run Doom, but how well is it going to run it? And but sorry.
Going back to kind of the server I recently built for myself, I put in an i5 13600K, and that has an iGPU, and so it will do 4K transcoding. I think Jason from Bite My Bits kind of tested it. I think it does something like 18 streams with that iGPU of 4K. It's very capable, but it's pretty, I know a lot of people say the kind of like the latest Intel CPUs use a lot of power. They're quite power hungry. They might be when they're kind of like working at 100% workload, but most of the time your NAS or your server is idling, doing very little. And like I said, I've got, I think, sort of 70 or 80 terabytes of spinning Rust in one array, and I've got some ZFS in there, another 40 terabytes. So there's quite a few drives in there. I would think, I can't really see from here, there's probably kind of 12 hard drives in there, and it idles at around kind of 80 to 86 watts most of the time. So I think that's quite power efficient, but I know a lot of people will think that's not when there's servers that will idle at 20. But my workload is a lot different because I will run VMs from that. I might do gaming on my UnRAID server. I'll spin up a VM, pass through the GPU that's in there. In that server, there's a 6600 XT, which is okay for games. And I'll pass that through and I'll do a little bit of gaming. So I've got, my desktop PC built into my UnRAID server. I very rarely use a real computer. Most of my stuff that I use is a VM running on an UnRAID server, other than my laptop here, which I really only have because I need to take it on site when I'm going out to work. So,
I mean, again, just before we move to my final point, the only thing I would add to that when it comes to the people that are very conscious of power consumption, generally it's situationally dependent. And a number of people I speak to, again, I think I mentioned this in the previous video, about that run mobile homes, houseboats, or looking for, they're running on metered or power connections. For those, they really are watching every single tiny kW. But this brings us to my final
I think
point.
for those people, maybe they're better to go for like the turnkey,
because I think
turnkey solution.
They kind of have
because
to.
UnRAID's great, but everything has its place. It isn't always the best choice for everyone, but it can be a good choice if that's what but that's what people want.
Which is what brings me to that last point I was going to say, which we've also kind of touched on in several different areas, and it's freedom. Great George Michael song, can't recommend it enough. But in terms of freedom, when it comes to turnkey NAS solutions, the kind of unwritten, unspoken agreement, not dissimilar to that of cloud services, is when you buy a NAS solution, you're kind of now stuck in that ecosystem. Now, I say stuck, that's kind of an over-exaggeration. You can, of course, use rsync, RTR, or just simple file sending from your system to another NAS, another turnkey NAS solution that may have its own OS, Synology to QNAP, QNAP to Asustor, Asustor to TerraMaster, TerraMaster to whatever. And you can migrate that over and enter into this new ecosystem. But very, very, very rarely, aside from a file folder structure, do I see a lot of the exporting of the configuration, the exporting of a lot of user preferences. Sometimes you can download it as your odd CSV or XML. But even then, a lot of the time, there's a lot of haphazard bodging along to move to this new ecosystem, because very few NAS brands really put in, turnkey NAS brands put in the extra time to allow external migration. And if you think that the system you're going for doesn't have the scalability, cost, and the rest that we've discussed, and you want to move to a new platform or move on to a new hardware system, the scalability is quite limiting, I think, on turnkey NAS solutions. And there isn't really a specific tipping point for that. The only tipping point I could really identify between turnkey NAS and UnRAID in the subject of long-term freedom is when home becomes business. That's the only one I could come up against, because when a home user wants to migrate towards business, then they're no longer thinking in terms of 3 years, 5 years, or 10 years. When it's a business, suddenly you've got insurance commitments, you've got legal commitments to hold on to data for substantial amounts of time that in most cases will outlive the actual system they are in. So therefore the ability to move on to the next system is incredibly paramount. And when it comes to UnRAID, I think as we've discussed already and we'll discuss now, it's genuinely unparalleled just how scalable UnRAID is, right?
Yeah, like the freedom to kind of move to different hardware. You can just move to anything really. So
that USB key movement, just to have your entire OS living on that USB and that same USB key.
A lot of people, they worry about thinking they don't want it running on a USB. They really worry about that. But it's not like when you run Windows, it's reading and writing loads of files to the USB. That just pretty much just stores your configuration really. And when you boot up, it just loads off that USB into the RAM, and then it just runs out of RAM, and the USB isn't really being, it might do when you install a plugin or make some type of configuration change, it will write to it, but most of the time it's not being used. And even if you totally kind of broke your USB key, it's pretty easy to kind of like, you know, just put another one in, even if you didn't have your configuration.
Or dupe it, It's a lot cheaper to have 2 USB keys than 2 whole NASs once you factor everything.
There's also a plugin called UnRAID Connect that actually makes kind of like backups of your license keys and your UnRAID flash drive every time you make kind of a change to it, that's kind of stored on the LimeTech servers if you want that. But what I'd like to say is, like, you know, it isn't something you have to have. A lot of stuff with UnRAID is like, you know, user choice. It doesn't force you to do, you know, to store your USB flash drive on the LimeTech cloud. If you want to, you can do that. So some people might want to. Some people who are very much kind of don't want any company to have anything to do with their data, they might not want to do that, and they might want to make backups of things themselves. But you've got flexibility and freedom to do what you want.
I mean, the last thing, just before we end the video, I actually had a question. It was on, I realised I was going to ask you earlier on. When it comes to those users that are moving from ZFS perhaps, which is, you know, quite resource intensive, and over to UnRAID. Now, UnRAID latest version, even the subversion, now has support of those of ZFS within those sets, those pools. Can you migrate an existing data set over to UnRAID as it stands at the moment?
So from something like TrueNAS, bringing it into UnRAID, I would say yes and no. You can for some. For like maybe if you've got like a RAID Z1, RAID Z2, it's pretty easy. You put the disks in. You tell UnRAID which disks are that pool, set the file system to auto and start it, and it will try and detect it, and it will just import it. But some more complex C pool types at the moment, no. But
at least they're developing it there. I don't know a single NAS brand that would allow me to move my Synology disks into a QNAP or a QNAP into an Asustor. So that in itself is still incredibly advantageous, and once again just doubles down on that scalability, really. But ultimately, the tipping point between Turnkey NAS, I mean, you're someone that's been using UnRAID for such a long time. I'll end this video on a simple question. What would it take for you to move back to Turnkey NAS?
I'd have to be paid an awful lot of money.
And I think on that note, that has been the tipping point from Turnkey NAS over to UnRAID, and ultimately moving away from paid complete solutions into bringing data into your own hands into the world of UnRAID. Once again, thank you so much for coming on the channel. And again, I'd love it if you plug your channel again, because I don't think we gave it enough plugging in the previous video, so go for it.
Well, thank you very much, Robbie. First, I'd just like, before I do any plugging, I just want to thank you very much for inviting me onto your channel. I've really enjoyed speaking to you and to your audience. I hope you found it kind of interesting what we've been chatting about, everyone watching. And if you want to learn more about UnRAID and setting things up, then please head across to my YouTube channel, which is SpaceInvaderOne. I'm sure Robbie will put a link in the description.
Absolutely.
And you'll find me on Twitter as well. Although I don't post there too much, but
Very few of us
you
do.
can
We've
follow
got
me there if you
we're
want
making
to.
content, people. But yeah, thank you so much for watching. Thanks for coming onto the channel once again, Ed. And apart from that, we will see you next time.
Thank you.